Hello, everyone. Oh, it's much better. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday to talk about infrastructure support for journalism. I'm sure over the last 3 days and late nights that we've all had many spirited discussions about the critical role journalism plays in a free society and all the important work that's underway to preserve and protect it. We've talked so much about the technological advancements that allow us to create and distribute content at lightning speed. Yet at the same time, it's never been more difficult to sustain journalism and the newsrooms that produce it. So what we're going to talk about today is what level of support these newsrooms need, not just the funding, but what kind of hands-on support do they also need in order to really thrive. I'm Mary Welter Brown. I'm the founder of the News Revenue Hub. I founded the Hub in 2016 after being the publisher at Voice of San Diego, which was really the first strictly digital, nonprofit, local news organization. And we built a very successful membership program to really help sustain the operations. And during that time, it became really clear to me that our peers in the space were struggling to replicate the kind of success we were seeing because they simply didn't have the in-house expertise and bandwidth to really develop and execute really sophisticated email marketing campaigns, which is really what's necessary. It's that ongoing kind of campaign roadmap that makes membership a sustainable revenue stream. So we created the Hub really as a grand experiment in 2016 to see if we provided the centralized services that made Voice of San Diego successful, in addition to a technology stack, a donation management technology stack, if we could see the same type of results, or if it was just a fluke that we were seeing in San Diego. So we launched a pilot in 2016. We had a for-profit national newsroom, a nonprofit national newsroom, 2 regional newsrooms, and a hyper-local site. None of them up to that point had really focused on raising small dollar donations. So they worked with us to sort of execute our campaign strategy using our tech, and within 6 months, they'd raised $1 million. So we were pretty sure we were on to something. We took a leap. Spun the News Revenue Hub off of Voice of San Diego in 2016, got our own 501c3, and then over the past 6 years have grown our team to 20 very specific subject matter experts in everything from product to engineering to fundraising. And now we've worked with over 100 newsrooms, and they've raised to date more than $80 million in volunteer donations, and that's all without a paywall. So obviously, I'm pretty bullish about the success and the importance of journalism support services, and I think my panelists today agree with me. We have Natalia Antelava from Coda Story, Jim Brady, the VP of Journalism for the Knight Foundation, and Aron Pilhofer, who wears many hats, but today is going to talk about his work with the Tiny News Collective. Just to sort of table set, when you think about really what it takes for a digital newsroom to thrive today, they need engineers who are capable of developing websites that are discoverable, easy to navigate, offer a beautiful user experience, but are also impossible to hack by bad actors. They need talented product specialists who know how to meet people where they are and deliver content to them via newsletter products, texts, podcasts, videos. We've talked a lot about AI. Imagine the type of expertise that a small digital newsroom would need in order to really leverage AI for their purposes. And considering that most digital newsrooms, independent newsrooms, have fewer than a dozen employees and are operating on less than $1 million budget, they're forced on a daily basis to prioritize the journalism, which is obviously they should, over these other priorities that are really necessary to build a thriving business model. So we are going to spend our time today talking about, luckily, this growing community of journalism support services that are now available and how newsrooms can plug into them. Aron, I'd like to start with you. In addition to the work that you do at Temple and the study of journalism, and I know that's such an important part of your world, you created the Tiny News Collective. Can you help us understand what you've learned so far and how the work you're doing there has really accelerated growth with these startups?
Yeah. Sorry. Jesus Christ. That's not. So the Tiny News Collective was actually born out of COVID, weirdly, not literally, but kind of. Heather Bryant, who is currently serving as the interim executive director, who is also a co-founder, and I and another colleague, we were running a project that was meant to help news organizations do sort of innovative product work and things like that. We had a bunch of partnerships all lined up. Everything was going to go great until COVID, and then everything melted away. And so we started looking around, trying to figure out, okay, how can we, solve a problem somewhere else if we're not going to be working with, sort of legacy newsrooms. And we started talking to very small publishers through an organization called Lion Publishers. It's the local online, local independent online news association. Publishers. Thank you. And we kept hearing the same things over and over and over again. These are really small news organizations, like 3 people. I didn't know how to run a business. I didn't know how to get incorporated. I didn't know how to find legal support. I didn't know anything about technology. We kept hearing the same things over and over and over again. We realized that there's a real need there for shared services focused on very, very small news organizations. There's a lot going on at sort of the medium level and large level, but not a lot going on for like independent solopreneurs. And that was that's where the Tiny News Collective came from. And so we are kind of an all-in-one operation. People think of us as, simultaneously a platform. We have a technology platform. We provide those kind of services, but we also provide a lot more. Alex Papachristou here, Lawyers for Reporters, is working with us to provide legal support, helping founders get incorporated, helping them figure out how to hire freelancers, vetting contracts, things like that. And that's really where the need is everything but the technology. I would say insight number 1 is this. We spend an inordinate amount of time at conferences like this talking about CMSs. We have talked CMSs to death, and I'm here to tell you the CMS is a solved problem, okay? We need to start talking about everything else. We need to talk about healthcare. We need to talk about libel insurance. We need to talk about accountants for reporters, right? That's the next step. We need to find and build an infrastructure that helps these really small news organizations grow really big.
Interesting. Natalia, you run a news organization. Help us understand the challenges. I know we could talk all day about the challenges and the struggle, but help us understand the challenges of running a small international digital newsroom with massive aspirations but limited resources, and how you feel like support services could plug in to be a part of the solution. And then I also invite you to talk a little bit about the shared services that you've experimented with at Coda to both monetize what you're doing and provide support.
Yeah. So
during COVID.
Can't believe all of us are doing this. Hi. Everything that Aron just said resonates completely. We didn't have answers to any of the questions. Like, so many startup sort of founders. I have a co-founder, so the 2 of us, both background was foreign correspondence. So very interested in global reporting, and they're very interested. And I happen to be Georgian, but I was with the BBC at the time when we were setting up Coda. And Ilan Greenberg, my co-founder, he was in the US. So our focus was always on Western audiences and kind of like how do you bring global reporting to audiences in the West and help them connect the dots and create context and continuity around this overarching crisis. So when we were that are shaping our world. So when we were thinking how to, what need we needed to fill with Coda, it was very much the lack of continuity and context in coverage of different issues. So we thought, we need to come up with a model to do it. And one thing that we came up with, we decided to, we were really interested in kind of creating the editorial process that would be complementary to the news cycle, but really also not a slave to the news cycle. So we did it by creating a thematic newsroom, we thought, and came up with the name and came up with everything else. Had no idea how to be both reporters, right? No management experience, very little. No idea how to actually run a business. But the idea was good, so we sat there thinking, oh, someone's going to come along and give us $1 million to do this. And shockingly, no one is. I'm still working on correcting this historic injustice. And because, startups vary, like Semaphore is obviously a startup with 25 millions. So there are very different startups. We were very much in the category of that tiny newsroom, but we did have a big global ambition. So we grew very slowly and over a long period of time because we didn't find someone who gave us a few $1 million. But in that growth, I think there were lots of lessons that we learned along the way, and being scrappy and not having a lot of money, we experimented a lot ourselves with sort of ways of bringing revenue. We've done different things. We set up a storytelling festival that we bring people to, and eventually hope that it creates a little revenue. COVID really messed with that plan. But we've also provided production services for a while to bigger newsrooms. So we would do animated films and create films for ProPublica and the BBC and others. And there were lots of, and today one of the bigger sources of income for us, of non-foundation income, is that we create podcasts for streaming platforms. So we have contracts with Audible and we're working on others. So we've come up with ways of raising money and growing the newsroom, and we're around 20 people now. But it always boils down to capacity for us. So having, we're a member of the News Revenue Hub, and having someone who is able to provide you services, to provide you with help with the membership, to provide you with marketing help, and I can go on listing things that, could be done in addition to, it would be great to have help with fundraising and someone who actually coordinates the funders and things like that. That's been pretty fundamental, because for us, unfortunately, it's still very much a matter of, making very hard day-to-day choices. We need to hire a development director and we need to hire an editor, and we can't do both. So it's constantly making choices. But in throughout that slow growth, and our ability to bring in revenue has also been hampered by the capacity issue. So, for example, we're now not doing that video work, even though there was a lot of potential in it, because we just don't have the in-house capacity to be doing that. So, yeah, a bit of a long-winded answer, but literally endless challenges. And it's really encouraging to see that funders are still starting to think about how to provide that infrastructural support to newsrooms, because it's really essential. And I think the kind of conversation is much more advanced in the US than it is in Europe or rest of the world.
Yeah, it's a great segue to Jim Brady. You've worn many hats throughout your career. You've been a journalist, you've been an editor, you were the owner of a multi-property media group. How has all of that experience really kind of shaped your perspective around shared services, and why is that such an important pillar for Knight right now?
Well, the most important experience was starting my own company back in 2014. I started a company called Spirited Media, launched sites in Billy Penn in Philadelphia, The Incline in Pittsburgh, and Denverite in Denver. And I went into it pretty experienced. I had been exec editor at WashingtonPost.com for 5 years. I'd overseen the development and design shop at AOL, and yes, it was cool when I worked there. That's how long ago I worked at AOL. There wasn't an embarrassment to have an AOL address. But I went into this pretty eyes wide open about. I didn't go into it, thinking I could just write stories and the business would just happen around me. I understood I had to have a tech stack and I had to develop business models and all that. And yet, even with all that experience, you get in there and you realize, my God, like I'm still struggling with like payroll systems and, oh, I have to incorporate. Oh, and I have to get trademarks on these brands. And like you just end up drowning in all of this administrative paperwork when, you know, really at the end of the day, you want to, I think, to focus your time on creating journalism that resonates with communities and figuring out how to monetize that are the two things you should be spending almost all of your time on. And if you're, to Aron's point, if you're wrestling with a CMS at this point, you're in the wrong CMS, because the bottom line is there are solutions out there that will allow you to publish without having to spend your time trying to, you know, figure out complex menus to figure out how to publish the site the way you want to publish it. There are people who know how to do that. So I think, so then I sold the sites in 2019. I wiped my brow with relief that I was able to exit successfully. But when I moved into this job, continuing to talk to more entrepreneurs, a lot of those things are still happening. There's a lot of progress that has been made. I mean, I think you're probably suggesting that the CMS thing is resolved for many reasons, but one of which is Newspack, which is a WordPress owned and operated content management system that's now being used by 200 plus publishers. And it's a common code base so that you don't get your own version of it. But because you don't have your own version of it and because you're not spinning off various different code bases, like you actually can pay a lot less for it. So there are sites that are paying $1,000, $2,000 a month for Newspack that were spending $5 or $6 a month on their tech stack. But they just handed the keys over to this tool and said, I'm going to take the time I've now saved. Because I think the other thing we have to talk about is, there's two things I think are important to talk about. We always talk about how to make more money, which is obviously a crucial thing for a site to exist. But you also have to spend less money. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about the expense side and how much money is wasted on tools that cheaper versions are available. You might have to give up a little bit of flexibility, but like if you can give up a little bit of flexibility but save $2,000 a month, you should do it pretty much every time. And then the third thing we don't think about is, like, you could argue the most constricted resource any startup has is money. The other constricted resource is always going to be time, and how much time I have to spend on different parts of this business. And if you can figure out a way to spend less time wrestling with CMS, less time with Alex's group, like figuring out how to incorporate in an efficient, smart way instead of the dumbass way a lot of us did it, or slow, dumbass way a lot of us did it, you're saving time. And if you can apply that time to things that matter, the state of your business is just going to be a lot better. So so after getting this job 18 months ago and talking to more entrepreneurs, it was obvious that continuing to focus on the infrastructure piece was really important. And so, in addition to Newspack, the Institute for Nonprofit News, INN, is something we funded pretty extensively. As Aron mentioned, Lion Publishers. And there's just a lot of really great services out there for people to jump into. Obviously, if you represent with Mary's organization and Aron's organization represented as well. And we funded the American Journalism Project, heavily. And American Journalism Project is helping startups develop the business. Ironically, the fact that it's called the American Journalism Project, they're not really funding newsroom staff. They are funding people who will make money for organizations. And the data that comes out of all of those organizations is really encouraging in terms of revenue growth. So it's an area we're going to continue to play in, and I think, having been in the digital side of things about 28 years at this point, I guess, 19, whatever the math is, 29 maybe. But I've just seen it from all these different angles, and this, to me, is just the right place to be right now, because there's a lot of really smart entrepreneurs out there with really great ideas who are going to run into these same brick walls if we don't start to figure out how to come up with solutions for them. And I would just note one other organization, because sometimes we think about these shared services always being technology and product. There's also just expertise, and I think in addition to what Lawyers for Reporters is doing, we fund ProJourn, which is a pro bono legal network run by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And that's now in 7 states and is providing pro bono legal services for publishers who can't afford those on their own. And because of that, there's an organization called Open Vallejo in California that's written a bunch of stories about misconduct at the Vallejo Police Department, and all of those stories have been lawyered by ProJourn. And so there's a lot known about what's going on in Vallejo that would not have been if they did not have access to an attorney, because they were getting a lot of pressure not to run those stories. And the stories that there's a lot of stories out there we don't know about because they were never published. And I think ProJourn being able to get stories out allows those organizations to build credibility and build whatever, revenue bases they're going to build. So it's just important that we we try to pave all of this infrastructure road. And I don't know, Aaron, I would be curious what Aaron thinks, but I feel like how much of the infrastructure road for local journalism is paved right now? Half?
Yeah.
Not even? So we have a lot of paving to do. So, and I think that's what we're going to keep our eye out, is how do we continue to plug these gaps?
Thank you. I know we've learned so many lessons along the way. We were one of the first scaled service providers, and we learned very quickly that like just simply offering the service and providing the tools was just part of the equation. We had, in order to really succeed with the newsroom, you have to develop trust, right? Journalists are very skeptical, and so a lot of this work involves getting in, working with these newsrooms, developing trust so that they let their guard down. And we're asking them for, access to their audience data so that we can help them make content decisions and build better newsletters that create more loyalty. We're asking them to let us write campaign copy for them so that they can help tell their story, which is sometimes uncomfortable for journalists to tell their own story. So we're really asking to be let in and to be a fractional part of their team. And so a lot of that is trust building. And I'm wondering, the three of you in the different capacities that you serve, have any thoughts on really what it takes to get a newsroom to sort of see support services as something that they would allow, and how do we get them to sort of take their guard down and be ready for something like this so they can take advantage of it? Yes, please.
Yeah, there's, so again, we went into this, my background is I used to run nerdy teams in newsrooms, right? So very tech focused. And that's how we started this. We thought of this largely as a technology problem going in. Newspack is fantastic. We are partnered with Newspack. We're providing sort of the ramp to Newspack. Newspack starts at $50 a month. We are $100 a month. We obviously provide technology that is not anywhere near as sophisticated as Newspack, but it leads in that direction. And that's, I think, what you have to sort of show a founder, particularly one who's coming from editorial, is that this path exists. Here it is. You follow this path. Don't deviate from it too much. And there is a step, and off you go. That's where we need to get folks. The problem we've had with, well, not the problem, the challenge is a lot of founders who come to this from a journalism background don't think of all these business services as like part of the job, and it is the job, and that comes as kind of a surprise to folks. I mean, journalists who end up in sort of a founder role, when in doubt, will just do more journalism. And that's great.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. And that's great until you're starting to think, okay, how do I actually pay for all of this? So we're building out a growth program, for example. You mentioned marketing. This is something that doesn't exist for little tiny newsrooms. We're building out, in addition to legal support, we're building out all these different services, expertise. We have Bridget Gallagher, who's one of the best fundraisers in the business, on retainer to help advise founders on philanthropic opportunities. We have a bunch of Temple students working at Tiny News, and they did a big research project around all of our founders and found place-based foundations that could, and in some cases do, support journalism. We've had some success with that. So there's a lot of support that we have to build, and I think, to answer Jim's question is how much of this is paved. It is at best, at this point, a dirt road leading toward a better paved highway, but we hope to solve that in the next few years.
Yeah, Jim, along those lines, obviously there's always an active debate about giving money directly to the newsroom to fund the journalism, or giving money so that they can have access to support services. Why sometimes is it a better investment? Why is the ROI more powerful sometimes when you're helping them actually add capacity to their newsrooms as opposed to direct funding?
I think it becomes math at some point. I think there are times people look at philanthropic dollars as being this endless pot of money, and it's not. And the bottom line is, if Knight Foundation or anybody else gets in the business of trying to solve individual problems for individual publishers, you'll run out of money before you get too far down that road, because there are a lot of problems and a lot of publishers. And so I think the idea for us is if you can fund things that all publishers can take advantage of, you're just you're just putting yourself in a much better position to, to have winners identify themselves, which I also think is an important part of philanthropy, which is, philanthropy has largely, if you have a contact at a philanthropic organization, you have a much larger chance probably of getting your hands on some money. But there are entrepreneurs out there who don't know anybody, who are not connected, who are traditionally unconnected to funders, unconnected to philanthropy, who have great ideas about how to cover a community. And I think if you provide all of these tools along the way, you're giving them a much better chance to put their hand up and show what they can do, rather than trying to pick these 10 organizations and say we're going to put a bunch of money into them. There are other organizations, some in the room, who put money into individual organizations, and that's needed too. But I think at the Knight level, I feel like if we sit back and we look at the infrastructure piece of this and try to fund as much of it as we can, we're just opening the door to lots of other people who are not known in the industry at this point. And I think so to us, that's really the model. And to use the classic infrastructure model, if other people are funding the creation of new sites, that's wonderful. The more the merrier. Thousands of more local news sites in the United States or anywhere in the world would be a great thing. But in that metaphor, if a new site is a home, you can't put 2,000 new homes in a development and not expand the roads and change the sewer system and get the pipes built. And I think we're focused a lot on that infrastructure, so that when other people fund the creation of more sites, they have resources to tap into to build a sustainable business. So that's why we've put a lot of our energy in that space. And we're not always loved for it. I think there's a sense that Knight should, just fund newsrooms, but I just don't think we see that as a viable path. If we just funded newsrooms, I don't think we would think our chances of having a meaningful impact would be greater. We think they'd be lower.
Can you provide the publisher's perspective on this, being someone who's obviously raising money, but also...
Well, obviously, I just want the money.
Yeah. I'm curious, though, you've started a membership program.
Yeah.
You've proven that you can get small dollar donations from people who care about you. Has that helped you as you go to philanthropists and say, look at all of these readers who care enough about us to give us their hard-earned dollars?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been kind of the biggest impact of being part of the News Revenue Hub and building out. And we have a very basic membership program because we still don't have a dedicated person that works just on membership. But what you get by using the service like the News Revenue Hub, you basically get all that. You no longer need that dedicated person. You can run a program, and there's this stuff that we want to do with it, but at least it's there. And I think what made a really big difference is you guys drilling into us, just keep asking for money, because, as both of you have said, we are so preoccupied with thinking about journalism. It's often hard to simply get into the habits and of, asking for money or doing any of those structural things. I mean, it's interesting. We are a US-based 501c3 nonprofit newsroom, although we're very dispersed as a team. But hearing about all the services that are available, right, and all the things that they're doing, I'm struck by how little I myself, who is in this world and is very kind of preoccupied and making sure that I'm across things, how much there is that I don't know. And I don't know whether it's a matter of getting the word out in a better way or coordinating more among the newsrooms. And I think this is where infrastructure, kind of the support organizations, whatever they are, can help too with building sort of better alliances and getting their message out and making things available in a clearer way.
I just wanted to add something too. We were clients of the News Revenue Hub at Spirited Media and in the early days of the hub, and this is why infrastructure can't just be technology. It needs to be expertise, because Mary's team was continually telling us we were not asking for money enough, and we felt like we were asking like 5 times more than we should be asking. And every time we'd like, we're already asking like 10 times a week for money, and Mary'd be like, you need to go to 11. you need to go to 12, you need to go to 15, you need to go to 20. And like you saw the results, because what we realized was we were actually building a brand people liked, so that asking for more money triggered a lot more giving. If we're just annoying them if they don't like what we do.
Right.
And the language that we used and how we asked for money was all stuff that was curated and developed out of the hub, and it was incredibly valuable because we did really well launching a membership program when we had no expertise in that area at all. And again, despite all my experience, I was reticent to ask as much as the hub was pushing us to ask, because sometimes you just need people who are going to provide services that are technically valuable to you, and sometimes you just need people to push you into uncomfortable spaces, and that's why you need to look at infrastructure as not just tech and product, but as like services and anything that can help you build a sustainable business along the way.
And I think that goes back to the trust question that you asked as well, because I think it's very difficult for newsrooms to trust companies and services that are stuffed with people who are not journalists. And we just had an experience of we've hired a PR person to do some PR for a project that we did. It was a disaster. They didn't get it. We spent a lot of money and they didn't get it. Because they were not promoting a journalism product, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it makes a real difference when and helps with the trust issue.
Yeah. It sounds like, I'm very embedded in this space, and so many of the programs that you were rattling off, I just wanted to write down, and I could see everyone sort of in the audience doing that. It sounds like one of the things that's missing is sort of just an inventory of all these services and how you can access them. I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions, and also want to say if there's other service providers here, please, share your experience. If there's newsrooms who utilize support services, feel free to share that experience. Lots of questions. We'll start here.
I can do it without a microphone or is there recording?
I'll do you next.
Thank you. So Alex Papachristou, Vance Center, Lawyers for Reporters. The startup media entrepreneur experiences various emotions, exhilaration, terror, and most notably, I think, loneliness.
Yeah.
There's a sense of being out there all by herself. And when we, as lawyers, say, we'll help you for free, there's a sense of gratitude that really is undeserved. And, and then I find that, as we start to work with more and more of these clients, and over 3 years now, we've helped 150 different news organizations in, I think, 32 states with a wide range of matters. We also have that sense of terror. But what we have to call on, because we're only 3 lawyers, and this is to the point of resources, is pro bono support from law firms. So over these 3 years, we've worked with 30 law firms across the country, many of them on many different matters. And in their areas of expertise, trademark protection, copyright infringement, incorporation, tax exemption. And so one thing for folks to know is that the private sector actually is out there available to you, at least in this legal field. And we actually can do what we do because of this sort of multiplier effect. 3 lawyers become 150 lawyers across states where we are not ourselves qualified. So that sense of loneliness, I think, should dissipate with this idea that the private sector, at least the private legal sector, considers local journalism to be not only a qualified pro bono project, but really an exciting one. Yeah. For these law firms, they work in the area that they know. There's nobody on the other side who's a client who will be upset that they're doing this work. So there's really a huge resource of pro bono legal support for startup media entrepreneurs, if they can find it. And we're happy to help them do that.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about this community, it is very lonely and it is terrifying, and I think that probably the most delightful byproduct of working in the News Revenue Hub with like 70 plus newsrooms, in very intense work, is the community that has been developed as a result of that. And you have all these newsrooms not only sharing their problems, but also sharing their solutions and back and forth dialogue that's happening. And I think as a result of that, we're seeing accelerated growth. We are having an amplified effect. There is a network kind of moment that happens when these newsrooms start to coalesce and share their ideas, and they inspire each other, and they help the newcomers avoid some of the mistakes that they've made, which does accelerate their growth.
Can I jump in quick while we're...
Sure, please.
Yeah, this question of trust is really, really a big
Yeah.
deal. And there's a good reason, because there are a lot of bad actors out there. I'm just going to be really honest. There are organizations that prey on the hopes and dreams of journalists who want to found their own organizations. And the people they are preying on are often the most vulnerable. And that is very, very problematic. So in addition to calling out the good organizations, we also need to start calling out the bad ones, and there are many.
Yeah, and I was going to add one more thing too. Is Alex? I mean, I don't mean this like how many people in the room know Lawyers for Reporters exists? Put your hand up if you've heard of it. Okay, that's pretty good. A Tiny News Collective, Newspack, yeah. So I mean, it's like, but it's still a minority of the room significantly. And I think this is the other problem is people don't know what services are out there. I think we had a infrastructure conference at night last year in Miami, and we brought down a bunch of publishers. Mary and Aron were both there. A bunch of publishers and a bunch of service providers for journalists. And you know, the blind spot for us, for me, was that I figured everybody in the room knew what everybody else did because they're all kind of playing in this space. And then after a couple of hours of talking, we realized we actually need to back up and actually have everybody get up and talk about what they actually do, because even the other people in their space didn't always know the full range of services. And so when you get to the actual publishers, they're even farther away from it all. So I do think figuring out how to better communicate all of the services that are out there is really important, because they're all incredibly valuable, but I think a lot of publishers don't know they're there. And how we figure that out is going to be a real challenge, but a necessary one.
It's on. Yeah, there we go. My name is Corinne Podger, and I work with the Walkley Foundation in Australia. So we're a national non-profit. And for the past few years, I've been working as a contractor for mostly Asia-Pacific training providers. I guess this is as good a moment as any, which will save me asking you for a meeting afterwards, to say what we seem to be missing is a way of finding the information that exists. You know, so you're saying the road is a dirt road, it's partially paved, but that's in the United States, right? In some parts of the world, in the Pacific Islands, in regional Australia, in, you know, regional parts of Europe, etc., it's not paved at all. You know, there are people who don't even know this conference exists.
Yeah.
So I think when you start to build whatever you're building, and I think there's a recognition of what that might look like, it's like the infrastructure to communicate the infrastructure. We need a journalism about journalism, right?
Yeah.
When you build that, just at least think, how will we also make this critical information available to newsrooms that are not in the United States, and also that operate in low press freedom contexts, in contexts where it's not possible to get a visa to come to a conference like this. I think if you think about that from a design perspective, when you're designing something, you design well from the start, and you think, how would we also make this internationally accessible? Then you don't have to bolt it on afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you. Great point.
Thank you. I'm Jen Stokes. My experience is maybe in Scotland and the scorched earth where all of our great and wonderful newspapers used to be, particularly. So I did my training on a local paper, which is this working class route into journalism that just barely exists anymore. But I also had the experience of working in a new media startup, which I think, if I described it in depth, it was hell in every single way. I have nothing good to say, and so I have extreme. I won't name
Can I
it
just
right
say
now.
it was not Coda? We've never met.
It was not Coda. It was a Scottish one. So it gave me this kind of extreme skepticism about this stuff, because so many things can go wrong sort of internally, especially when it's quite idealistic and sort of outwardly like we're the good guys, and so inwardly there's just lots of bullying and misery and terrible exploitation. I wonder, now that I still really believe in these local newspapers, but there's hardly any left. And I wonder if you think they have a role and a place in this kind of ecosystem you're talking about. Obviously, in the Scottish context, we don't have that tradition of philanthropic funding of newspapers, of journalism. Everything's a little bit more grim. And I wonder if you have any words of encouragement to, to make me feel better.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually were talking to some folks in the UK, London, not Scotland, but about whether the tiny news model could work, you know, I was going to say here, but kind of there. And I think it can. I would really love to know, because I haven't found any data, anything that isn't just sort of superficial, like how bad the news desert problem is in the UK and Europe. I suspect it's a lot worse for all the reasons you cited than anybody knows, particularly at the community level. And so I do think this model could work elsewhere. It can work in the UK, it can work in Europe. We have no desire or ability to expand globally. That's not what we're about, but I think the model can work. And to Corin's point, everything we're building is going to be open and available. We're in the process right now of building a growth, like a manual, sort of a how-to guide on how to do everything from pricing your product to growing your newsletter audience, like from nothing. And that will be open and available. Lion Publishers has an enormous amount of open information, tutorials about how to launch a business that's very U.S. focused, but that model also could be adopted. So I don't know that there's an easy answer to this, but I do know that the problem exists and there are solutions and there are folks in this space that are willing to share, in fact, delighted to share.
Yeah, and I would say Newspack is one of the ones I mentioned that is available over anywhere. So that's an international global thing. But the other thing I was going to say on the newspaper. So two responses to what you're saying. I do think newspapers have a chance to make it not as newspapers so much, but if they had embraced digital and they actually embraced some of the same concepts of not feeling like they have to own all their own infrastructure, which is traditionally how newspapers operate. We need to run everything from A to Z. I think if you can give up some of that power. But if you try to have that conversation with a lot of U.S. newspapers, they basically will say thank you very little for that feedback. But I do think if you're willing to make that shift. The other thing I was going to comment on when you said you're working, this is maybe a harsh thing to say, but if you're talking to somebody who wants to start a website and all you get 100% idealistic vibes and 0% business vibes, I don't care how good the idea is. Do not take that job. And I think that's been a huge problem in the States where people they see an opportunity, they start covering things, and they think the business will just develop out of the money will just start falling from the sky. And it doesn't. It's really hard to build a business. And if you don't even start with the idea that you're trying to build a business, you're doomed.
We have time for one more.
I wanted to ask about your financing and how you sustain yourself, because I believe that it would be hugely beneficial to have something like the Tiny News Collective in Europe. But at the same time, I'm from Austria. We have a total of 2 foundations that are active in the space. Yeah. They're not interested in funding. So the only way we have traditionally, we have a much more active state. But the problem is, then again, in Austria, is in the last 10 years, we slid from rank 6 or 7 on the Press Freedom Index to 34. So now you don't want the state taking a more active role. What other options do we have? Is it a member-to-member approach? Do you have any experiences?
Yeah. I can speak. The News Revenue Hub is 50% self-sustained by the fees that we charge our newsrooms and 50% still dependent on philanthropy. We have a roadmap to get to 80 to 90% self-sustained, and that's our goal. I think the tension is keeping the services affordable and the barrier to entry low enough where newsrooms can actually afford to access us, while at the same time being able to sustain ourselves and not be competing with our newsrooms for the same funding. So it's a delicate balance, but we definitely feel like there's a possibility to sustain ourselves eventually.
I think on the Europe question, I think the membership model does work, and it worked very well in the Netherlands. Interestingly enough, it then didn't work with the correspondent. It then didn't work in the United States. But it did work. So I think in Western Europe, the membership is a solution for so many newsrooms, especially in geographies where there is more wealth. But then you look further east, and there we have a complete disaster. And it really highlights the need for more coordination among these big organizations and journalism supporters, both the funders, but also government projects that support local newsrooms, and like USAID does a lot, places like IREX and Internews. There are these big umbrella organizations, but that conversation about infrastructure has not even began. I mean, they are spending millions and millions on training, same training they've been doing for years. But the infrastructure conversation is really in very nascent stage.
And to the question about Tiny News specifically, I've launched several nonprofit news-aligned organizations. In the past, none of them had a business model of any kind. It was pure philanthropy. And that had to change with Tiny News. It's so hard to run an organization that way. So much like the News Revenue Hub, we took a lot of inspiration from what Mary's doing. We have a sort of a very blended revenue model. Our members pay us fees. We provide fiscal sponsorship, which is a kind of a quirky American thing, but there are fees attached to that as well. So there is a world in which 5 years from now, Tiny News is something like self-sustaining. I'm not quite sure we're going to get there. But I do think that model could absolutely work in Europe as well. And if there are folks here who want to talk more about it, I will be around and we'd be delighted to.
Yeah, I make the same offer. All of our technology is open source. All of our campaign toolkits are open and available to use, so feel free to reach out to me directly. We come to these conferences because we want to be able to spread this type of support across the globe. I think that's all the time we have, so thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your time.